Welcome to our Emotion Matters in Higher Education podcast series. We're your hosts, Katie Ippolito.
And I'm Cathy Mansfield.
In this episode, we're going to be focusing on university teachers' emotions. We'll include some practical tips as well as insights into why we feel the way we do. Let's begin with a thought experiment. So we'd like you to bring to mind a teaching experience that gave memorable and strong emotion. So think about what was that emotion, and also why do you think you felt that way? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to gather your thoughts, and then we'll move on.
So we're going to come back to this later on, and kind of as we talk through the podcast, we'll think about kind of our own emotion in these situations. I think it's really helpful to start by thinking, why are teacher emotions important? These are often overlooked, both in the literature. There's a lot more literature on student emotion than there is on teacher emotion, and also in our practice. We're often talking and thinking about how students are feeling rather than how we are feeling. But it's really important, I think, to consider teacher emotions. Teacher emotions directly influence our educational design as well as teaching decisions. So by this, I mean both in terms of what we choose to teach and how we teach it. And also, I think how we're actually feeling, for example, on the day that we design and develop our teaching, can impact teacher emotions. One of the other reasons that teacher emotions are important is that teachers provide continuity in higher education. Yeah. So students are quite transient, maybe doing a course 1 year and then, moving on the next year, whereas teachers might be teaching the same course year on year. And I think how we feel, again, will play a big role, and the continuity is definitely relevant. Kind of related to this, staff really matter. So morale and culture in higher education, how we feel about our teaching, how we feel about our roles, again, kind of highlights why teacher emotion is important. And the final thing is actually that teacher emotion influences student emotion. We'll talk about this and unpack this a bit more later in the podcast. But if we're really to be student-focused and thinking about our students' kind of student-centered manner, we should also be thinking about teacher emotion.
Yeah, it's definitely something we should talk about more. And actually, one of the most interesting conversations at our recent Emotions Special Interest Group was what influences teacher emotion. I find that really important to talk about.
Yeah, there was a lot of things that came up as part of this discussion, actually. So we kind of, I suppose, to categorize them, some of the things that influence teacher emotions are quite practical things in a classroom. So student attendance, have your students turned up today, or are you kind of teaching to a half-empty classroom? That definitely impacts how we feel. Even things like the technology, is the tech working today, can have a really big impact. And also, of course, student engagement, whether students are really kind of taking part actively. Sometimes I think the kind of teaching setup more generally, maybe in our department, can have an impact. So, for example, do we feel well supported in our teaching role by colleagues, for example? Also, what's the topic that we're teaching and how do we feel about it? So sometimes I think confidence in the material is a big factor. If it's a topic that we might be an expert in, might be very familiar with, we can feel much more positive about teaching that compared to something that we might be maybe a bit more nervous about. Also, how we're teaching it. So we might be, for example, doing a more active learning session or maybe a more traditional lecture, perhaps a lab situation, again, can influence how we feel. I think whether we feel valued plays a really big role, both by our colleagues and also by the students, and we'll touch on this later on.
Yeah.
I think the other kind of category of factors that's really important is the kind of practical life, personal things. So family can influence how we feel, our commutes, the weather, almost anything. Whether we've had a decent night's sleep the night before can play a really big role in how we feel in a teaching context. So some of these things we can do something about. We might have a choice, for example, about what we teach or how we teach it. Some maybe we can't your train's late that morning or train's broken down. Nothing we can do about that. That's still going to impact how we feel. But kind of awareness of this, I think, can be a helpful starting point. Also need to remember that the context is important. So just as a quick example from my own practice, I was giving some lectures recently where attendance was quite poor. Students had an assessment due at the same time. So really a lot of the cohort was not there. And it would be really easy to get kind of openly a bit frustrated or disappointed with the students who were there because you put a lot of effort in and attendance is low, but actually remembering the context and remembering that the students who are there are the ones who did attend.
Yeah.
And therefore we kind of have to regulate that emotion a bit. Kate, I don't know if you have anything about really whether to express this emotion. Like, how do we decide whether to express this emotion?
Yeah, I suppose I've learned about this over time and from experience. So I agree with you. I try not to express my dissatisfaction about attendance to the students who are there. That doesn't seem fair at all. Although something interesting someone said was they feel that sometimes their students sort of feel a bit sorry for them when they have half a classroom. So I try to pick up the emotional mood and I'll say, there's a small number of you today. Thanks for coming. It just means we can spend more time or we can do something more interesting and be more discussion based. So I try to turn it into a positive, I suppose, to try and influence their emotion positively. But I've also learnt not to make assumptions about why students aren't there or why they're late. So I recognise the emotion that is important to me. I think being annoyed is an important signal, but I don't tend to act on it. And I'm often glad that I didn't act on it because when I do some investigation, there's often a good reason for the lack of attendance or engagement. So I think what you're talking about there, Cathy, is that what influences teachers' emotions often is a sense of control and value that really contributes to their emotional experience. And Reinhard Peckrin and colleagues talk about this idea of control value theory that says just that. Our sense of control and value affects how we feel. And this is often applied to students, but it's also really relevant to teachers too. So just to pick up on a few of the things you've said. So control can include a fear over lack of control of student attendance, or the fact that there's an exam next week for a different module, or a breakdown in technology. And control can also relate to our sense of competence. So if we're teaching a topic that is quite unfamiliar to us or using a method that wouldn't be our first choice, that can really affect the sense of control we have and lead to people feeling quite frustrated or even anxious. So adopting more student-centred approaches where we give control and responsibility to students can provoke such difficult emotions for teaching staff, I've noticed, that some of them just avoid it altogether. They don't want to go near those emotions of giving up control to students. And in terms of value, I think value can relate, as you said, to whether you feel valued for the teaching you do, but also whether you find value in what you've been asked to teach. If you feel passionate or even interested or think something's important, you feel very differently about it than if you find it quite irrelevant or boring. And also the technique. If I'm asked to teach something in a tiered lecture theatre in the dark to 300 students on a Friday afternoon, I might feel quite differently to being able to do something much more explorative, discussion-based in a flat classroom with 50 students.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those things all affect. And I suppose linked to that is this idea of understanding that teachers' emotions might be linked to teaching goals. So Anne Frenzel has done quite a lot of work thinking about how teacher goals affect student emotion in the school sector. And the way we feel as teachers, I think, is related to our judgment, both before the session as to whether we think we can achieve our goals, maybe during the session and after the session, whether we've achieved our goals. If I think about my own teaching, that really affects me. If I'm thinking, I think this is going to go well, there's a lot of positive emotion for me. I have self-belief in myself, but also in the students. So Anne Frenzel talks about how student behaviour, student responses to our teaching decisions has a big effect on the way we feel. And I suppose that relates to, our evidence of that.
So how do you assess whether you've achieved the goals?
Yeah, how do we get the evidence of our goal achievement? So I think that's something we don't do as well as we could. I think we need to evaluate more. And I don't just mean sending out surveys to students that they might not fill in, but be evaluating all the time, kind of watching things like participation, trying to kind of pick up on what students seem interested in, and so on. And I think we misread emotional cues all the time. I did some work with a colleague who said that the teachers he spoke to said they think that students feel anxious about learning statistics or bored. And actually, when we asked the students, they felt much more positive. So I think maybe sometimes we assume students feel a certain way. Maybe we're kind of projecting our own emotion onto them. I don't know. So we should get more feedback from our students. A colleague was telling me recently that their students were marvelling over how they'd managed to do practicals with microscopes during the pandemic, and that they really appreciated the effort that the teachers put in. And in turn, that teacher said it made them feel really seen. And it made me think about how motivating recognition is and how important that is for contributing to positive teacher emotion. So I think we should gather more information to really understand how students experience our teaching, and it would probably make us feel more positive.
Yeah, I think this link between like staff or teacher emotion and student emotion is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So this idea of kind of reciprocal emotion, or you mentioned Anne Frenzel. So Anne Frenzel has done some work on reciprocal enthusiasm. So my own kind of interest is in positive teacher emotion. So maybe thinking about enjoyment. So for example, if a goal of our teaching is for students and perhaps as members of staff to enjoy a teaching session, how do we achieve this? So just to kind of outline some of Anne Frenzel's relevant work on this idea, as I mentioned, of reciprocal enthusiasm. If you kind of imagine this process is cyclical. So essentially the idea that staff emotion or teacher emotion influences student emotion. So what do I mean by this? If a teacher is enjoying teaching a class, they're going to display some kind of enthusiasm, for example, while they're doing that teaching. And then the students can observe the teacher enthusiasm and then kind of feed off this and enjoy the class. And I think many of us have experienced this, if there can be a real buzz and you feed off each other. So students then enjoying the class, they might engage better. And if they're having this kind of enjoyment, and the teacher observes the students' engagement, again, leading to them enjoying teaching the class a bit more. So you imagine this as a kind of cyclical process. The problem, of course, is if this breaks down. So I think the important parts of this, in terms of kind of practical tips that's really helpful, is that students sometimes do need to be able to observe teacher enthusiasm. If we're really flat in our teaching, then students can't kind of feed off that positively. And also the other way around. So you mentioned before maybe misreading students' cues, and that's really interesting. I think we also, as teachers, need to be able to observe student enjoyment and student enthusiasm for that to positively influence our own emotion. So really fascinating work on how they link together. And in terms of kind of practical strategies that link from this, it does seem to make sense to plan something in our teaching sessions that will make us as teachers enjoy that session. It will make us feel happy. Yeah. So for example, in my own context, I really enjoy running like active learning or sometimes active teaching sessions and doing, I teach cell biology. So we do some games. We play Cell Biology Articulate, for example. And, I'm having a good time, partly because I see the students having a good time. And this, I do think you can sometimes kind of feel that reciprocal enthusiasm in action. But we often don't focus on how we feel about teaching a session. And maybe we should if it then links so strongly to student emotion.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that we're highlighting visible enthusiasm as being so important. And I know it is generally considered a teacher attribute, but whenever I've been described as an enthusiastic teacher, I can't help thinking that it would be better to be described as a knowledgeable teacher. I just have this nagging feeling. I suppose that's maybe the academic culture that we're in. And I've talked to students and colleagues about what enthusiasm is in relation to. So what do we mean by the enthusiasm? And I think it's enthusiasm for what you're teaching, as you say, the cell biology. It's enthusiasm for the methods that you've chosen to use. So that active learning approach. But I think what students are often talking about is it's enthusiasm for them and their learning. And that's linked to this sense that we care. So if we show enthusiasm, it's because we want to be there with them.
Absolutely. I think certainly in my research on teacher emotion, there's a lot coming out about how the importance of building connection and building that relationship with students, which I think is exactly what you're talking about. So relationships do seem to be key to positive emotion. And okay, what does this look like? Well, certainly staff members or teachers in kind of interviews and stuff that I've done previously really seem to enjoy the bit at the end of a lecture where the students come and ask a question.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly because that's where they're showing their engagement, their enthusiasm. They're kind of sometimes creativity, like they've taken the material that you've given them and gone a bit beyond that. So seeing where that enthusiasm comes through can really impact how we feel. I think on a really practical level, how to kind of build those relationships and things, of course, it can be really tricky if we're lecturing to, 200 students and everything feels a little bit anonymous. But sometimes if we can use student names, if we are doing smaller group teaching or tutorials or lab sessions, even something like using a student's name can help to build that connection that really does help to impact positive emotion. Also, back to kind of feedback of emotion, can we think a bit more about what do students enjoy in a session and perhaps design that in a little bit more? So give them perhaps a bit of agency or a bit of creativity. We have a colleague in my Department of Life Sciences who uses videos as a coursework assessment. And I think so students really enjoy this assessment, well, as much as anyone enjoys an assessment. And I think that's because they have some control of that and staff then feed off that. You watch these videos and it becomes quite a kind of positive loop.
Yeah, I think that we've discussed quite a few examples through the podcast. That was certainly our intention. But I'm just going to take the opportunity to draw some of these out and consider what we can do to work positively with our emotions in teaching. So I think it's helpful if as teaching teams, because as you've said, we work quite closely and we do influence each other's teacher emotions, it is to think together about what our overarching teaching goals are. It might even be that some of these are contradictory. Can we iron that out? Which ones are complementary? Is our goal when we're teaching to convey knowledge to students, or is it to build their ability to apply that knowledge, or is it to develop their belief in their ability to do it in future contexts? Those are quite different goals, and they can be achieved in the same session, but certainly it has to be done in different ways. And if students aren't aware of those goals, well, it's very unlikely, that they will be thinking that it's about their belief to transfer that learning elsewhere. So I think we need to be clear amongst ourselves and clear with our students as well. And in a future episode, we'll think more about emotion regulation. But I find James Gross's work really useful. He has an emotion regulation model where he identifies a series of strategies that we can use to manage our emotion or regulate our emotion. And one of these is situation modification, this idea that if we're aware of what is causing a lot of negative emotion for teachers, we could just change the situation. We could change the design, we could change the setting, the number of students, we could modify. And then the second one, which is a very effective strategy, is this idea of cognitive change or reframing, thinking differently about the situation. That's another way to regulate emotion. And I suppose when I'm thinking about our conversation up till now, we could change our goals. We could think maybe that goal is unrealistic for this context. Maybe there are too many contradictory goals, or maybe students aren't aware of our goals. And the reason they're not attending and not participating in the way we would hope is we just haven't been clear about why we're doing what we're doing and what our goal for them is. And I think we do need to collect evidence from students to help us to see if we've achieved our teaching goals, whether those are knowledge related, whether they're social, relational goals, identity goals. Maybe sometimes we need evidence that we are a capable teacher and the effort we're putting in is worth it. And just linking to what you've said, which I think is so important, it would be good to find out what they've enjoyed and why, because then we can build more of that in, can't we? We can give ourselves and colleagues confidence that is important, even within science-based teaching. The more experience I get, the more I think it's important to express how you feel, including in response to student behaviour, and also, importantly, why you feel the way that you do, because they might try to interpret it anyway. So a recent example I had was I teach a group of 40 undergraduates in a module called Science of Learning. And one week the students were talking over me a lot and it felt very disrespectful. It was quite sort of distracting for me. And I felt that some students couldn't hear because of it. And I was thinking, what shall I do about it? We seem to have a good rapport. I don't want to damage that. Anyway, the next week, for some reason, whether the activities were tighter, I don't know, they were listening. And so at the end, I said, I noticed today that you were not talking over me. You were really listening. And I was really worried I was going to have to say something this week to you about that behaviour. And I didn't want to be all teacherly because we're in a university. But actually, I didn't have to. And so thank you for doing that. So I kind of acknowledged and said how it made me feel much happier about it. So yeah, that was something I chose to do.
I think sometimes it's really positive to show the emotion. Is there sometimes a risk? Sometimes it feels like there's a risk of vulnerability if we kind of show that emotion.
Yeah, that maybe that idea of emotional streaking. I don't think I did that, but I was very cautious about sharing my emotion in that instance, despite the fact that I think they're so important. I think it's a judgment you have to make, doesn't it? And only share your emotion if you feel it will be recognised and helpful. So I do talk to these students about emotion in learning, so they didn't think it was so weird that I told them how I felt. I think there's a risk that if you don't express and explain your emotion, students will infer it anyway, and they might mistake it just like we mistake theirs. So there's some interesting work, again, I've read it in Frenzel's papers, where, if we show a student that we're disappointed in them, some people would say that was a bad thing. They would avoid that. But actually, what she commented on was, if students think we're disappointed in them, it gives them this sense that we believe they could do better. And that gives them hope that they could do better and they might respond. Whereas if we show them pity, which you might think was the kind thing to do, actually that might just confirm for them that they can't do any better. So the way people kind of interpret but also make sense of emotion is very contradictory and difficult to predict. So I'd rather tell directly and ask directly rather than inferring.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. I think just to kind of wrap things up, thinking about certainly planning our teaching, if we can, as we mentioned before, plan some situations we won't be able to change, student attendance, students talking over us. But perhaps when we are planning our teaching, we could teach a little bit for ourselves. We can try and plan something into our teaching sessions that maybe we will enjoy, that will therefore impact students positively. So maybe we can't change the subject matter, for example, but we could include examples that are of interest to us that will show our enthusiasm, and maybe even design some kind of active learning in, and therefore kind of enjoy it. And as we discussed before, the students might be more positive as a result. So back to this kind of student connection and idea of reciprocal enthusiasm. I think sometimes actually focusing on, for example, enjoyment can be really, really helpful. So going back to the thought experiment that Kate asked about at the start, and this kind of situation where you have a strong emotion in a teaching context, I hope that in this episode we've given you some tools to consider how maybe you feel the way you do about your emotions in teaching, and also how we might use our emotion and our awareness of this in our teaching. Might it promote positive emotions to be clearer about your many teaching goals? Or maybe even you could reconsider or change those. Could you collect evidence to see if you're achieving your goals? And also we've kind of discussed and I suppose thought a bit about the benefits or sometimes risks of sharing your emotion with students. It definitely sometimes can be really positive. So I hope we've given some space and credit to the idea that teacher emotion is important and valid and really worth considering and focusing on.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you're able to join us again next time.
Goodbye.
Thanks.